Welcome back to another episode of Get Your Popcorn. This week we are doing Pocahontas, the 1995 animated version from Disney. I swear when I was laying out these episodes and I went to post, doing an in and around American Thanksgiving was not my intention. I'm Canadian, so our Thanksgiving is almost 2 months ago, right at sort of the beginning, middle of October. So that was not intentional. However, this idea of doing this film was sparked by one of the creators at a Thanksgiving dinner. So that wasn't intentional. So the whole Thanksgiving timing, I didn't think about it. I'm not American. So if you're seeing this and you're American, our Thanksgiving is nowhere near this. I do want to put a bit of a trigger warning on this episode for colonialism, violence against Indigenous people, racism, historical rewriting, exploitation of marginalized communities, and cultural erasers. So please listen with care. And just a disclaimer off the top, this week I dive into the 1995 animated film Pocahontas, a controversial entry into the Disney canon. This movie reimagines the real-life story of Amunut, or a more private name for her was Matoaka, known as Pocahontas, sort of more widely, an Indigenous Powhatan woman whose life and legacy was romanticized and distorted for mainstream audiences. This is a highly problematic film for so many reasons, including but not limited to romanticizing the tragic story of Pocahontas, centering the narrative of John Smith, framing him as a hero, and downplaying the horrible impact of the English on Indigenous peoples. There is no excuse for this. I wish Disney had done the research needed to make this film beyond casting Indigenous voice actors. The care seems to have stopped there. This film could have had much more to say if history was even remotely taken into account. The film centers a European perspective rather than an Indigenous one. The real story is far more complex, brutal, a story of survival under colonial pressure and not of romance. There's something to be said from the music conveying an overall message of shared humanity. As a kid, the message I received from this film was the importance of environmental protection, finding the beauty in other cultures, and that the land that I live on was and is stolen. Although this is positive, this does not make up for the film's glaring shortcomings. I'll end this intro with a quote from Roger Ebert. Having led one of the most interesting lives imaginable, Pocahontas serves here as a simplified symbol. This episode approaches Disney's Pocahontas with care and honesty, and I will talk about its artistry, its impact, the painful truth behind the story. Please listen at your own comfort level and take breaks if you need to. So we'll start off with the history of Pocahontas herself. Her real name was Matoaka, which was a word called the playful one. She was the daughter of Chief Powhatan and his people, and that is located in modern-day Virginia in the United States. John Smith arrived in 1607, like the movie states, but Pocahontas was only 10 or 11. So the accounts of these stories are largely from kind of John Smith himself, some of the people who had spoken to Pocahontas and Chief Powhatan, but it's largely based on an oral history and then stuff written by John Smith, who is not considered always a reliable narrator. So a lot of this stuff is a little bit debated. I did look through quite a bit of research trying to find what I felt was sort of the story that most people sort of agreed upon. So that's what I'll be giving here. There's really great websites. A lot of them are by some of the national park stuff that was done. I will link everything in the show notes down below so that you can read those articles. They're very, very long and they're very, very interesting. I'm not going to be able to do her justice here, but like I quoted earlier with Roger Ebert, she did live one of the most interesting lives. And like just the resilience of her is incredible to read about. So I highly recommend going and finding out more about the real story of her. Anyway, so the story goes that John Smith had been captured, and that the details, and this is disputed, that he was set to be executed and Pocahontas threw herself on Smith, which changed the tune of Chief Powhatan, who let him go. John Smith then went back to the settlement of Jamestown, and Powhatan and his people would send food and aid via Pocahontas to keep the peace between the settlers and the Indigenous people. Over time, that deteriorated as the English began to take more and more and more, and then Powhatan ended up moving his community further away from Jamestown and banned Pocahontas from going to visit, as he did not deem it safe anymore. As the English began to take more and more and more, obviously the Indigenous people needed to protect themselves, protect their communities, protect their entire life that were there. And so Governor Radcliffe was killed and 25 other colonials were ambushed. Radcliffe was apparently skinned alive, and his bits were tossed into the fire. John Smith left for England after an injury, and Powhatan and Pocahontas were told that he had died. However, he did not. He made it back to England. Pocahontas did have a first husband who was named Kocoum, just like in the movie. Of course, she doesn't get married to him in the movie. She was then captured by the English for leverage and taken to another community called Henrico. And essentially, her father then cooperated with demands for the protection of his daughter, like any father would. Here, she was forced to learn English and about Christianity, and she met her next husband, John Rolfe, and they had a son. However, reports of the son was that it was born out of rape and that the pregnancy happened before she had actually met her husband. 1614, she was then baptized and given the English name Rebecca. She was then brought to England by the London Company to show off, and I'm putting this in quotations, the tamed savage from the New World, so that Jamestown would look very successful and it would look like a safe place to drive new investment. In England, she ended up speaking with John Smith, and she confronted him about the treatment of her peoples and him lying about his own death. In March of 1617, Pocahontas and her husband were supposed to set sail back to Jamestown when she fell ill and died. The exact cause is, of course, unknown. So that is the very, very, very Cliff Notes version of the life of Pocahontas. But as you can see there, not a romantic tale, a very, very tragic one, and a very exploitative one, which Disney has continued with this. And I'm sure you can see it in my shirt. I would consider, I guess, a Disney adult. I've been to Disneyland like 6 times. It's where I go on vacation. And this is something I've had to trying to come to terms with. A lot of the darker history of Disney and some of the more poor choices that they have made, some of the exploitation that has been done, has kind of been ongoing learning for me. And I have to be quite honest with you guys. This isn't something I always really thought about in my little worldview. For a long time, I never it never really occurred to me that Pocahontas could be problematic, just looking through it with a lens of not filtering it through a real story. I wasn't taught that this was a real person. It was something I discovered kind of on my own later in life, and you kind of live in a little bit of a white privilege bubble, and I have to cop to that. This wasn't something I deemed problematic until I began to learn more about it as like in my 20s. It wasn't as a teenager. It wasn't definitely not as a kid. Despite the fact that there were Indigenous people at the time who spoke about the film, including the 2 women, and I'll talk about that later, that helped with the research for the film, felt quite upset that the Disney tossed out so much of the history and essentially just cherry picked essentially like the names and locations in order to fit their own sort of Romeo and Juliet narrative, and then chose to center it completely from a Eurocentric viewpoint and not an Indigenous one, and then engage in some sort of stereotyping as well. And this is something that has taken my own learning to do. This is the responsibility, I think, as a white person, to do your own research on this kind of stuff, and to, it's really hard to kind of face sometimes. And by really hard, I'm going to put that in quotations. It's not that hard. But I think as a white person, it's important to not get defensive. It's important to get curious. Because of course I could sit here and say, well, Pocahontas gave me this message and this message and this message as a kid. It's got the pro-environment stuff that it talks about stolen Indigenous land. It talks about that we are all created equal. It does discuss racism. It does point out that the English, the bad guys, the villains in this story. I can say all that. But by doing that and immediately getting defensive, it then dismisses the issues that are voiced by the Indigenous people in real life, saying this is why it's problematic. And so I think as a white person, it's very important to not get defensive and to get curious. Because yes, I could receive all those messages, and I did as a kid, and those are great. But it's not just me. My own personal messaging that was delivered to me as a kid is not what everybody else is going to be getting from this film, particularly as a white person. And also, the more as I get older, the more I've gone on to have my own children and to think about these things and what I want my children's viewpoints to be and how I need to explore all this kind of stuff so that I don't pass down any harmful stereotypes. I don't pass down, this air of, privilege and like feeling comfortable in like my bubble and not wanting to push away from that and not wanting to be a part of the solution. Like, I want my kids to see me wanting to be part of the progress and finding out my own information and getting curious and not getting defensive and wanting to hear other perspectives. And so I think it's taken me a little while to get to doing Pocahontas because I just felt like I needed to learn a lot more and to talk about it in a way that's going to do the person herself justice, that I feel is knowledgeable and nuanced. And I know I'm not going to be able to completely capture it here. There's no way I can, especially speaking from like a white perspective. I don't understand the nuances of Indigenous culture. That doesn't give me position to speak on these issues at a greater sort of capacity. So I think I wanted to talk about this film, and I think it's important because I have covered a lot of Disney on here, and I do love it. But it is disingenuous for me to not call out the faults too. And for me to talk about some of these things, as a white person, to be like, yes, your experiences as a child and the positive you received for some of the messaging is great. That's awesome. However, that's not the whole story. And your desire as a white person to protect what you view as a child as then going into an adulthood should not take priority over somebody's lived experience. And, the ultimate dismissal of the Indigenous people that helped with the research of this film, and I will talk a little bit about it. It was a bit disputed. The people that participated in Pocahontas, the Indigenous actors, have always spoken quite highly about it. This is very similar to how I felt trying to explain The Color Purple, was that the actors involved loved the project, spoke very highly of it. And then, a lot of people in the greater community found it highly problematic. So I will talk about both things. Again, it's really not my place to say either or. I just am going to be presenting the information. But I think it's my duty as a white woman to bring the attention and the platform I can to it and talk about why a lot of these films from, our childhood that we may love and may have received great things from they're not perfect. And they weren't perfect in the time. This also isn't an issue of being a product of its time. This is 1995. And at the time, there were people that said, no, we don't love what this is. And that was sort of pushed away. I definitely don't think Disney will remake this one for live action remake. I think at some capacity. And I noticed that Pocahontas isn't as available on merchandise as she was when I was a kid. When I was a kid, because I grew up in the 90s, she was on everything. I had Pocahontas pajamas, backpacks. I love, when I'm saying I love this movie, my parents had to buy another VHS. I wore this one out. I loved Pocahontas, and she was available through all kinds of stuff. Miko was on everything. And so Disney has sort of removed itself from that over time because they don't want to touch it or really acknowledge a lot of the more problematic things about this film. So let's get into the pre-production. So Michael Gabriel is sort of the genesis of this. He was one of the co-directors on The Rescuers Down Under and sort of pitched the idea of doing a story about Pocahontas after seeing a book about her life at a family member's Thanksgiving dinner. He pitched it in what was called a gong show meeting, which was essentially when Disney creatives got together and just did pitches of different things. And his pitches, and I'm going to put this in quotations, so this is his words, not mine. An Indian princess who is torn between her father's wishes to destroy the English settlers and her wishes to help them. A girl caught between her father and her people and her love for the enemy. The pitch was well received as it fit alongside the studio's desire to have a Romeo and Juliet type story. So Disney executives, after the success of Beauty and the Beast, wanted to steer a film in a more serious direction tonally in order to essentially bait Oscars again. So the two films they were working on at this time were The Lion King and Pocahontas. And interestingly enough, The Lion King ended up being their pretty much biggest success ever. And ended up being their prestige picture, even though Pocahontas initially was what everyone was shifting their focus into. People were begging to be removed off The Lion King and put into Pocahontas because they thought this was the Oscar movie. Interestingly enough, I believe The Lion King, if you ask most people, is what would be the prestige picture. So the filmmakers went to Jamestown to do research. They consulted with a woman named Shirley Costello McGowan and Debbie Costello. They were both Powhatan women descendants from Pocahontas. Shirley later regretted helping because Disney made the film so historically inaccurate. They also did interviews with historians at Old Dominion University. So for casting of the film, we have Irene Bedard as Pocahontas for the voice acting and Judy Kuhn singing, and she was actually cast first. For John Smith, we have Mel Gibson. For Governor Radcliffe and his assistant Wiggins, we have David Ogden Stiers. For Miko, we have John Kazir. For Chief Powhatan, we have Russell Means, and Jim Cummings is his singing voice. For Thomas, we have Christian Bale. For Ben, we have Bill Connolly. For Lon, Joe Baker. Percy, Danny Mann. For Flit, we have Frank Welker. That's the voice of Fred from Scooby-Doo, if you're curious. For Nakoma, we have Michelle St. John. For Kokwam, we have James Apadmut Fall. For Kiakta, we have Gordon Tutusis. And for Jim Cummings, again, is the singing voice. For production, animators took inspiration from both Shirley and Debbie for Pocahontas' design, as well as Naomi Campbell, Kate Moss, and even her voice actor, Irene Bedard. There was a woman named Dinah Taylor who sat for a number of sessions to get some of the movement down, and 55 animators alone worked on her character. There was some computer animation hybrids that were done in this film, and that was specifically for Grandmother Willow's bark. Alan Menken did the score and songs, while Stephen Schwartz did the lyrics, and Schwartz actually went to Jamestown to do research as well. And if you think you recognize that name, you totally do, because Happy Wicked Week, everybody. He is the creator of these songs for Wicked. So upon release, this film grossed $346 million on a $55 million budget. Reception, it currently holds a 58% on Rotten Tomatoes. And for Letterboxd, it holds a 3.3. I gave it a 3.5. And you know what? If you had asked me 10 years ago, I probably would have given this a 4.5 or a 5. And it's only my retrospective reviewing and knowing what I know now where it makes this film harder to watch. And that's because the score to go down. If you had asked me in a point in time when I knew nothing about the history and I didn't understand the context of the film, I would have rated it higher. And that's just the truth. This is, something over time that the more you learn, the more it can a little chip away at some of that childhood nostalgia. And that's okay. I think as white people, we need to get comfortable with that. It's okay to let some of the stuff that you loved as a child go, or to go, I appreciated that then, but now it doesn't sit the same. And that's okay. We need to get comfy. We need to stop being so outraged when people voiced issues with some of the things that came out when we were kids, or earlier than that, and why they're problematic. We need to stop being so defensive and angry, and we need to start being curious and accepting. Roger Ebert gave this a 3 out of 4, and like I said earlier in the episode, having led one of the most interesting lives imaginable, Pocahontas serves here more as a simplified symbol. So Russell Means, who is the voice of Chief Powhatan, was a staunch defender of the film, claiming it was the first time that there was acknowledgement in film of Europeans with the goal, and this is his quotation, to kill Indians and rape and pillage the land, which is something that I do think is quite a big positive of this film. The message that you get as a kid is that the Indigenous people, this is their home and it was invaded, which I think if you look at film before that, that is not the concept. Indigenous people are not portrayed that way. They're often portrayed as, for lack of a better word, they're savages. They're portrayed as in the way, as violent, as stopping settlers from getting what they need to, And again, I'm going to put in quotations, when kids growing up would play cowboys and Indians, the Indians, again in quotes, are the bad guys. The cowboys are the good guys. And in this film, it flips it to what the narrative is more like, which is the Indigenous people did what they needed to do to try and protect their communities, their land, their way of life. And then The Atlantic, Sophie Gilbert praised the film for its portraying of settlers as villains, however criticized the stereotyping and for the lack of nuance around Pocahontas herself, which I think that is where I sit in my review of this film. I would say is that there are good things, but here are some really glaring misfires. So this film was nominated for 2 Academy Awards, and it won both, but not in any of these sort of more prestige categories, more the technical categories. So it won Best Original Score against The American President, Sabrina, Toy Story, and Strung Heroes, and it won Best Original Song for Colors of the Wind against Dead Man Walking, Have You Ever Really Loved a Woman from Don Juan DeMarco, Moonlight from Sabrina, and You Got a Friend in Me from Toy Story. So the film opens up in England, 1607, and I will resist the urge to sing the little shanty that they do. And John Smith and Governor Radcliffe and a man named Thomas and a few guys are boarding the Susan Constant, which is about to set sail for the New World in the pursuit of gold for the Virginia Company. And they sort of we sort of get to introduce these characters. We see Governor Radcliffe, who's this pompous asshole, and his little queer-coded, essentially servant named Wiggins, but yeah, very queer-coded there. John Smith, who has been this hero who has explored many, many lands. He's this well-regarded hero explorer. And then we meet Thomas, who is this sort of young guy. It's his first exploration. He's quite nervous and is very clearly admires John Smith immensely. During the sailing to the New World, they go through a bit of a storm and Thomas is thrown overboard and John Smith heroically dives off the edge of the ship and scoops Thomas up and rescues him to safety. And as they're approaching the New World, they all kind of talk about adventure, finding gold and fighting. And again, putting this in quotations because it's from the movie, Injuns, and potentially sort of settling their land, what they can get from them and defeating them. And, there is a lot of conversation where they're very much the people that because they don't know what they're going to find. Already the viewpoint of these people is that they aren't really people, that they're less than human and that they are just casualties getting in the way of what the settlers want. We then get to see a little bit more of Radcliffe. We get to know a little bit more about how he's a pompous asshole. And he essentially is just like, I don't give a shit about any of these guys. They are just essentially machinery to get gold out of the ground for me because he wants fame and glory. So John Smith then sings a song about how he is just wanting a life of adventure and to explore. So they kind of put him a little, they try to juxtapose him and Radcliffe a bit, where we start to see John Smith's viewpoint as wanting to explore and discover, and Radcliffe's as wanting profit exclusively. But let's not pretend that exploring isn't invading here. And that's the chip and the nuance that's missing from this film is okay, we're glad we're calling out Radcliffe. Radcliffe is the bad guy for a lot of this shit. Of course he is, right? He wants to kill all the people. He wants to take all their land. He wants to take the gold that he thinks is there but isn't. He wants to get everything out of there. And John Smith is just here wanting to explore. However, John Smith equally dismissive of the people, and exploring is still invading, and that's what the film doesn't acknowledge, and that's the problematic part. I'm glad we called out this part, this very glaringly obvious issue, but this is still an issue too, and that's the issue overarching with Pocahontas, is that there are some great callouts, but it is not even remotely nuanced. So then we jump to Chief Powhatan, and his warriors are coming back to the community they have, and they're being greeted by everyone there, and Chief Powhatan is looking for his daughter, Pocahontas, and she is not there. And, they explain that she's off doing her own thing, and then he says something like, she's a free spirit, just like her mother. We then cut to a shot of Pocahontas on this cliff edge looking out at the water and dreaming of bigger things. And the animation in this film, there's two films that I think are the most beautifully animated films of all time. And that is Sleeping Beauty from 1954 and then this film. Stunning. They are stunning. These are the most beautifully animated films of all time, and I will put them up there with some of the most beautifully shot films of all time ever. These can go toe-to-toe with any major motion picture that you think of in terms of stunning cinematography. Stunning. These films are beautiful. Despite all of Pocahontas' many flaws, the animation is some of the most beautiful I think we've ever seen on film. So Pocahontas' friend Nakoma kind of canoes into the bottom where the cliff is in the water, and she says, your father's back, you need to go see him. And so Pocahontas looks for a bit like she's going to turn and she's going to kind of come down the side of the cliff and go meet Nakoma, but she decides to run and leap and dive off of the cliff to meet her friend. They then go back to the village and she talks to her father, and her father tells her that Kocoum, one of the bravest warriors, has asked for her hand in marriage. But she is real unsure about this because she dreams for this bigger life, this more expansive life, and she thinks that Kocoum is very serious and not fun. And you know what? He doesn't seem like that fun of a guy, but he's stable and he's steady. And so she tells her father that she doesn't think so, but essentially he tells her to like think about it. And she believes, because she keeps having this dream of this spinning arrow, and she tells her father that she just believes that her path is different than just settling down. Powhatan then gives her a present of the necklace, which is from her mother's wedding day. Her mother has died because it's Disney, and God forbid we have one alive mother. And he tells her that take the steady path, steady like the river. And then we get the song Just Around the River Bend, where Pocahontas is going off to visit Grandmother Willow, and she's canoeing through the river. And, the song essentially talks about, do I take this smooth course, or do I follow my path and long for adventure and to see what the world has to offer, this bigger and better life that I dream of? And I think a lot of us can relate to that. It also very nicely, like, kind of already we're seeing the position that sort of lines her up with John Smith's, is they're both seeking this life of adventure that will eventually lead them to each other and keeps them separated from their respective groups. When she gets to Grandmother Willow, who is a old woman spirit who lives in a tree, her face is in the bark. She tells Pocahontas that essentially, like, your signs and what you need to do are all around you, and that you need to listen to your heart, and the spirit in there will guide you. And during this, she sees over top of Grandmother Willow's branches, which she thinks are odd-looking clouds, and she climbs up, and she actually sees the sails of the Susan Constant. She's also followed by her two animal friends. Unlike a lot of Disney movies, these animals don't talk. So there's Flit the hummingbird and Miko the raccoon. And this was a decision that was made by Disney executives, again, to give it a more sort of realistic, then this is more gearing it towards more of like a prestige film instead of a Disney animated film. They're gunning for Best Picture with this one. Anyway, so Miko and Flit kind of follow Pocahontas as she climbs up to see what is going on. And she sees John Smith step onto the land in all his glory. Pocahontas hides from John Smith so he can't see her, but Miko is very, very curious, the little raccoon, and goes out and sort of meets John Smith and begins this like ongoing bit of Miko stealing biscuits. We then cut back to the settlers, and Governor Radcliffe sings his song about gold. The song is called Mine. And this is the song that is very clear about what the English are there to do. It's to exploit the land, to kill the people, and to take what they want. And the entire crew sings it as they begin to dig for gold. And Radcliffe then tells John Smith to make sure that none of the quote-unquote savages interfere with anything, and to just kill them if they try to. And they begin to cut down the forests, dig up everything, and you start to see the destruction of the land. And it's because because it is a true, like, some of this stuff is true, and that is for sure true, that, colonialists came and exploited the land and the people. But it's illustrated really well through the animation because it is drawn so beautifully. To watch that animation get destroyed by the characters is extra. It hits you a little bit harder because the way the land looks after the English are there and they cut it down and they build their fort is so strikingly, glaringly ugly and opposed to the beautiful landscape and nature that the Indigenous people are in harmony with. The Indigenous people have very clearly been there for obviously thousands of years and lived in harmony and have an amazing understanding of the land and how to work within it and how to be a part of the ecosystem. And that's something that a lot of white cultures do not have a concept of, where Indigenous cultures do. Indigenous cultures are very mindful and aware that everything affects everything, and they're part of the ecosystem in the nature of the way their practices were set up, the way that they often did. They spent time in different areas depending on type of year. They had very specific ways in which they hunted and did different things. So the land did not get overexploited. Like, often we have these like crop droughts or dirt or stuff that doesn't have the minerals in it needed to grow plants anymore. And that's because, settlers, when they come here, they just plant and plant and plant and plant and plant until the land goes dry. Indigenous people moved around. a little bit more. They had different areas and different things, different sort of patterns in which they moved year by year and were able to live in harmony for thousands of years. And this is illustrated beautifully in this sequence. So the indigenous people are now, they become aware that there are settlers on their land, and they engage in a little bit of a battle. And this is, where Radcliffe again orders anyone. He said, anyone who steps foot on this, kill them. The chief then consults the shaman Kiata, and he says that the newcomers, this is done with sort of illustration in fire smoke. The quote is that he says that these men are not like us, but strange beasts. They stalk the earth like hungry wolves, trying to consume everything in their paths. Which, he's not fucking wrong. He's not wrong. That is what is happening and what happened in real life. And so some of these things are, I think what also makes Pocahontas so disappointing is that there's these little sections or these nuggets of truth that are like, God, if you just dug into that more, we could have had such much more interesting and truthful film than the one that we get. We then have some sequences where Miko, the raccoon, begins to terrorize Percy, which is Governor Radcliffe's little pug, which is very funny. There's one where Percy's getting a bath and getting fed cherries, and Miko steals all those cherries, and it's cute. I like those animated sequences. It helps bring a little bit of levity to some of the scenes that are a bit more hard-hitting, which I like. It's very Disney. And this is when we transition to John meeting Pocahontas. So he's exploring, and he comes across Pocahontas, and he sort of sees her in a kind of a flash, and he starts to pursue her a bit. And then all of a sudden she sort of steps up from behind the waterfall, and she's just so strikingly beautiful. He's sort of taken aback, and he doesn't want her to run off, and he wants to talk to her. And she initially doesn't speak English because of course she wouldn't in real life. But then she listens with her heart and can speak English after that, which, we're gonna, for sake of the plot, that's what had to happen, I guess. But he could have listened to his heart and spoke her language, could he not have? And so they begin to have a conversation about what is happening and why they're there. And John Smith said, I'll read a little bit of dialogue. John Smith: we've improved lives of savages all over the world. Pocahontas: savages? Smith: not that you're a savage. Pocahontas: just my people. Smith: no, listen, that's not what I meant. Let me explain. And he sort of grabs her arm, and she says, let go. And he says, no, I'm not letting you leave. And she begins to go away from him, and he says, look, don't do this. Savage is just a word, a term for people who are uncivilized. And Pocahontas says, like me. And John Smith says, well, when I mean uncivilized, what I mean is, Pocahontas says, what you mean is not like you. And so this is where we get the sequence of Colors of the Wind, which I think is still one of my favorite Disney songs of all time. It's a beautiful sequence. It's a beautiful song with an amazing, amazing, amazing message. And that's what makes this film sometimes complicated to talk about, is because there are little bits of stuff that is so powerful and so great. And I think some of the message that you get hit with, especially as a kid, was just this wave of kind of understanding and desire to have everything work together and to understand that we are all the same and we are all connected. And children learn so much through music. I know I do. I know my children have. And so stuff like this, it's there are these little bits where you're like, that was great. You should have yes-anded on this. This is an amazing song with a great message, where Pocahontas is she's the voice, she's the teacher, she is the one who is right, and it is John Smith who has to change his viewpoint to meet hers. He has to match her in terms of her understanding, her knowledge, her worldview. And that is so positive. And then, you've got the rest of the film that is pretty problematic, but this is this little bit in it, this little I don't know. It's complicated to talk about Pocahontas, the film. And we go through the sequence, we see the bears are diving through the river. It's just so beautiful. And then he talks a little bit about how they are there for gold and then to build the settlement. And she said, well, we don't have gold. There's no gold. This is we have corn and we have all these things that are great, but we don't have what you're looking for. Tensions begin to build between the removed from John Smith and Pocahontas, the tension between the settlers and the Indigenous people are beginning to grow because of the Governor Radcliffe is convinced that the Indigenous people are hiding all the gold for them. And the Indigenous people are like, why are you fucking invading us? Please leave. So tensions begin to grow. The Indigenous people are very worried, rightfully so, about their communities and have reached out to the other Indigenous tribes in the area for backup, essentially. And the settlers are getting more and more angry, and Radcliffe is feeling more and more hostility with his people against the Indigenous people. So things are kind of coming to a bit of a fever pitch here. Pocahontas then takes John Smith to meet Grandmother Willow because she wants there to be a solution where the two different groups of people can come together peacefully. And Grandmother Willow says, like, look at you two. You have already made progress with each other. You can see each other. So you just need to expand out to each of your individual groups to bring peace and to show that they can be together. So after that, John Smith and Pocahontas are going to leave, and they realize that at least that they cannot be together if their two sides do not get along. And then they kiss. And Kocoum has been watching them because her friend Nakoma had told Kocoum that Pocahontas had gone off with John Smith, and he attacks Smith out of jealousy, I guess, because it's certainly not for her well-being. And this is another thing that I think is not great. Like, they make Kocoum like a villain for no reason other than he's just a guy that really likes this girl and has gone through all the like proper networks to make this happen at the time. And, you know, these people are trying to invade his land. So I don't know why they've chosen to make Kocoum a bit of a bad guy. But anyway, so he then tries to stab John Smith, and Thomas, who knew that John Smith had gone off, kind of comes to his aid because he was looking for him, and he shoots and kills Kocoum. John then screams at Thomas to get out of there before the Powhatan people arrive. And when they find Smith, Pocahontas, and Kocoum's dead body, they take John Smith back and declare war on the English. And Pocahontas desperately tries to explain to her father what has happened, but he won't listen to her. He is going to execute John Smith at dawn. He's being held there until the morning, and so she asks to say goodbye, and she says, "I'm so sorry." And Smith says, "For what? For this? I've gotten in worse scrapes than this. Can't think of any right now, but..." Pocahontas says, "It would have been better if we never met. None of this would have happened." Smith says, "Pocahontas, look at me. I'd rather die tomorrow than live 100 years without knowing you." And Pocahontas says, "I can't leave you." And John Smith says, "You never will. No matter what happens to me, I'll be with you forever." And then she has to, of course, leave. So then while this is happening, Thomas gets back to the settlement of Jamestown, and he tells him of what has happened, that John Smith is captured. And this is where they get ready for battle with the goal of basically killing everyone in Pocahontas's tribe. And Radcliffe uses the racism and the fear to sort of fuel this, and they prepare and go out. This juxtaposes with the Indigenous people and Powhatan getting ready for battle as well, and they sing the song Savages. And the song hits hard. But the problem with this is we have both sides calling each other savages and singing about it. The desire for the message of the song is we are the same. They're both, you know, depending on what side you're standing on, the other person looks like the villain. The issue here is that it frames their battle as the same when it is not. The English are fighting the people that live there to exploit their land and kill their people. That's what the English is. That's their goal. The goal of the Powhatan is defending themselves from being invaded, and one of their best warriors has just been killed for no reason. So to put them on the same thing for myself seems really tone deaf, because that's not what's happening. They aren't the same. It's not the same thing. They didn't declare war on each other. The Indigenous people were invaded, and then people started getting killed, and they have a right to defend themselves. The English invaded and started fucking up everything, as they are known to do. And so the song Savages, although it's a well-written song and it's pretty dramatic and haunting and sort of helps bring the film to this fever pitch, kind of making them mirror images of each other isn't accurate and isn't honest about what would have been happening. Pocahontas then realizes, when speaking to Grandmother Willow after this, that the spinning arrow from her dream is actually from John Smith's compass, and that it's going to lead her where she needs to go. And this is where she decides that she is going to stop this from happening. And she's running, and just as her father is about to swing down and kill John Smith, she throws herself over his body. And she just says, if you're going to kill him, you have to kill me first. And she calls on her father to look around at what's happening, on all the violence and the death, and whether or not he wants to perpetuate this. And he's hit with this same little bit of wind that she gets earlier in the film when she's on top of the cliff, this wind of inspiration and this knowing, like this feeling within your heart. And he essentially declares a truce, and that there'll be no more violence, and that they're done, and that they need to come together, and that Pocahontas is the example. And Radcliffe is not pleased about this part. And this is where the film decides to center a white man for no fucking reason. Is we have here John, as Pocahontas gets off of him and they've declared a truce and whatever, Radcliffe goes to shoot Powhatan, and John Smith jumps in front of Powhatan in order to save him. So then Pocahontas has this 30 seconds where she gets to be the hero, until John Smith takes that away by ultimately taking a bullet for Chief Powhatan, which is not how he got injured in real life, by the way. I digress. Anyway, so the men are then horrified that Radcliffe shot John Smith, because John Smith is their fucking hero. And they all very much listened to Chief Powhatan when he declared truce and realized that him and Pocahontas were correct. And so Governor Radcliffe is then kind of handcuffed and bound by his own people and brought back to the ship, and they have to sail for England because John Smith has been shot, and he will die, they say, when he's not, if he isn't taken back to England for the doctors there, which is insane because the doctors didn't know what they were doing. And then moving somebody for months on a ship where they have no access to proper nutrition. Realistically, John Smith had a much better chance of surviving had he had stayed put with the Indigenous people. Because, by the way, they had been using plants as medicine accurately for a long time. This is where a lot of our pharmaceutical information comes from, guys. All from plants. And Indigenous people had a real good idea of what to do before Western doctors took over. At 1607, what are doctors doing? What are they doing over there? They're bloodletting people. They have no idea what's happening. This is not modern medicine. So the Powhatan people then provide a bunch of food and aid to the settlers as they sail back for Jamestown. And Pocahontas kind of has to make a decision about what she's going to do, whether or not she's going to go back with John Smith or she's going to stay. And she decides ultimately to stay. And there's this kind of beautiful thing where she's running and she kind of seems like she might. The ship starts to sail away and she runs up to a cliff to kind of wave goodbye. And the wind sweeps through her hair and goes out over the ship. You see it through these beautiful leaves, and it goes past John Smith because she'll always be with him. And that is Pocahontas. So yeah, guys, not an unproblematic film. I hope I was able to give this film kind of as much of a nuanced take as I could. I know there's shortcomings to my own view of this. I hope I've given it justice. I hope I gave Pocahontas herself a little bit of justice by speaking out about her actual life story and the problems within this film. I hope I did this with as much nuance. I put a lot of really hard work into prepping for this film. So I hope everybody has a really great week. And next week, we'll be doing Wicked for Good.